So my name is Brandi Morin. I'm a poet, I'm a spoken word artist. I'm also someone who's very enthusiastic about human beings, and so like, I'm happy to be here today, you know? Happy to be the one speaking to you before anything else happens. I have the pleasure of representing Massy Art Society on this stage. Massy Art Society is an Indigenous-led space led by the wonderful Patricia Massy, who will be selling you books as well. Yeah, round of applause. It's good to make your boss blush every now and again. A little bit of attention. Massy Art Society is a literary space. It is an art gallery. It's a space that welcomes conversations, community building, literary activity, particularly for over-excluded artists. We view what we do at Massy Art Society as one of many possible iterations of decolonial, anti-colonial work as we try to invite the sorts of stories that will interrupt the ongoing colonial story of this place called Canada. So now I make the awkward segue to say that this event is sponsored by the government of Canada. Yay! Wonderful mixed feelings. Yeah. Good. Thank you for your support. Thank you. Thank you for your support. But more importantly, it's my honor and duty to acknowledge that this event, this city, this museum exists on the unsurrendered, unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples, and I'm so glad that we can have this sort of event to sort of, honor the spirit of storytelling, honor the spirit of Indigenous brilliance, honor, the reckoning with Indigenous strength, and again, the interruption of the ongoing colonial story of these lands that we inhabit, and our efforts to try to reroute that story. And so, with that said, I will introduce to you by way of reading a bio, sort of the featured reader, or not even sort of, the featured reader of our evening, and then after the reading, I'll introduce our moderator to you, and then we'll have a lovely, good old time. All right, so, let me introduce you to the wonderful Helen Knott. Helen Knott is a Daneza, Cree, Métis, and mixed Euro descent woman from Prophet River First Nations living in Fort St. John, BC. She's the author of the nationally best-selling book, In My Own Moccasins. Her second book, Becoming a Matriarch, has been released by Knopf Doubleday Publishing. Helen has a bachelor's degree in social work and has worked in advocacy and wellness with Indigenous communities for almost a decade. Helen has pieces published ranging from poetry to academic articles that focus on the connection between violence against Indigenous lands and violence against Indigenous bodies. She's currently taking time to work on her third book. Third book already? Oh my goodness, making us look bad out here. Come on now. Helen is taking time to work on her third book, a fiction whose story will be rooted in her people's territory. Join me in welcoming our featured reader for the evening, Helen Knott.
And by I started on my third book, I'm 5 pages deep. And I've been at that 5 pages for 2 months. Tansei Jahanache, Sidaze Dashnateke Doshe Ashe Katasaki. I am so happy to be here and to be in space with people. And I think initially I was feeling a little bit nervous with all the literary events coming up and going places because I've just been in my northern bubble for so long. And then I was okay, if I just reframe that and think about how I get to be in relationship with people, how amazing is that? So thank you for taking time out of your day, and I know it's a long weekend, to come here and to be in relationship with me. That sounds weird. How is the volume? Do I need to be louder? Are we good? Okay, cool. So with that, I'm gonna read a piece and then tell a story and then possibly read a piece. We'll see what that looks like and what it feels like in terms of how I gauge the energy of the room. And now I'm just saying everything out loud into the microphone. Okay, interlude number 3. My mother's spine morphed into a question mark during the last year and a half of her life. A pronounced curve in her upper back formed during the aggressive chemotherapy. Mama was 51 years old, and it was as if her body was asking why. My mother's body was a question mark. Her absence is a silent sound present in every word after the opening line. Everything after her body is not an answer, but only more question. The question mark surrenders itself to the unknowable. It unfurls and lets itself be held by the earth that sustained it. It is a line now that is submitting itself to erasure. There is no longer a question, there is only space. In her absence, there is so much terrifying space. Since she left the world, my shoulders gather tensely, hunching forward in a desire to protect. It is as if my shoulders, spine, and ribcage hatched a plan to create a safer place for my heart. Maybe her body is destined to emerge out of my own. Maybe my body needs to feel close to her, and this mirroring of movement is its way of remembering and keeping her near. My body is a memory. My body is in a state of active recall. My body is a portrait of things loved and lost. I have inherited the knit nose, lips, and eyes of my dad. I can't see her and my reflection. Where are you? I lose myself pinned under my gaze. My shoulders crowd forward, my spine curves. This is the question mark I am becoming. I cannot write about all the ways her body betrayed her, or rather, I will not write about these things. As women, what do we have if we do not have sovereignty over the stories about our bodies? Mama was a private person. Her agreement to be in my first book came with the understanding that our story might give hope and insight to people who struggled with addiction and depression. It is an additional and unnecessary intrusion to write in detail about how cancer denied her privacy over her own body and ate at her autonomy. How Mama's body succumbed to mortality can only be truly known by her, and I would not dare to try to tell that story. As a daughter and as a writer, I must meet some stories with refusal. There are some questions that I cannot forget, as they pull present moments into focus. I once met a taxi driver in Vancouver who had immigrated from Iran some 40 years earlier, and I asked him if he yearned for home. He paused for a moment before a look of longing flooded onto his face. You know how you never forget your first love? He asked. I nodded. His question summoned the imagined futures my first love and I created together. Futures we whispered about after the midnight hour. Futures that we were never quite able to speak into existence. We concocted a series of alternate pathways, like the choose your own adventure novels, but for our lives, and ultimately never chose any of the paths. These futures included becoming elders together and having babies with rolls of fat, sharp Cree features, and shocks of dark hair. Every door closing on these imaginings felt like a small death. However briefly I had believed in them, I had invested in myself in them wholly. And you don't forget that kind of faith. You can't erase the memory of the type of love that promises you forever. Leaving your country is like losing your first love, the taxi driver said. You are always searching for things that remind you of her. You go to places where you can feel her beside you. You eat foods that remind you of her. You listen to music that brings back memories. You are always wanting to feel close. I nodded again and turned my gaze outward toward the city streets. It took me years to learn how to return to thoughts of my first love without wounding, and I wondered if it had been the same for the driver. And perhaps only time makes us brave enough to reminisce and submit to the power of memory. His statement rings truer for the love of my mother. I search for her presence in everything and everywhere these days. His words summon the lines of the Sudanese-American poet Safia al-Hilyo, who writes about love songs from her home country, saying, "I never hear love songs like this in English, songs that are as much about a country as they are about a woman, songs where woman is country, before we grew bitter and learned not to make a world out of a person. My mother was my first country. Her skin was the first map that my fingers learned. She was a physical manifestation of medicine. She was sustenance and birdsong, and she was the mountains that protect and the waters that give of themselves. This life without her is a state of diaspora that I cannot remedy." My mother's body was a question mark. The question mark unfurls and lets itself be held by the land that sustained it. My mother is now the land, and the land is now my mother. The physical line that once separated has been erased. I cling to territory as I would my mother's hand. It is all I have left of her. The land, her body, my body, is a portrait of things loved and lost. There is no longer a question. I lose myself pinned under my own gaze. There is so much space, so much terrifying space. In her absence, I am becoming. I did an interview earlier today, and this guy was asking me, like, I thought there was gonna be so much more about Site C in your book. And I don't know if you're familiar, like, if you know my background, like, there was a big thing, it was a big, and I always say that, like, my greatest love stories have been with women in my life, like my mom, my grandma, my best friend, but also with water. So the Peace River is like one of the greatest loves of my life. And I thought about that question, and I was like, yeah, it was just such a process of mourning, and I felt like I could only hold so much heartbreak in a book, and I wasn't able to venture into that realm in terms of relationship to water and what it means to lose that and actively mourn spaces that, you know, are going to be flooding soon in our territory. And I was talking to this fellow he's gonna love this story when I tell him, you were brought up at the book launch, but he's Muskogee Creek and he's from Oklahoma. And I was like, yeah, so when you do come to territory, I'm gonna bring you to the river so you could introduce yourself. You can just say hello to the waters. And in that moment, I was like, oh, like that's the equivalent of like me bringing you to my mom, because I don't have that, but that water also holds that memory of the women in my life from generations and generations. So I was like, you can introduce yourself to the land. In absence of that, that's what I have. So. And I'm gonna read something short before we move into the next part. So, you'd think that I would like have thought of some fodder to fill up the empty spaces, but I did not. Okay. This is a excerpt of a chapter when I was in Guatemala. So I'm just jumping into the middle of the story. So I'm gonna be seeing someone here for some healing work named David E., just to give a little bit of the backstory of where we're jumping into. When evening finally came, I jumped in my Uber and the driver whisked me away down cobblestone streets and beyond the crowds of tourists to a distant part of Antigua. As we drove farther and farther from the familiar, the sun tucked itself away behind the mountains, and the driver circled around the bumpy streets that looked more like back alleys. We were lost. I called David E., and he said he would wait outside. We looped around the block for the third time, continuing to dodge the giant dirt mound that swallowed half of the road. There he was, in the middle of the road, a giant white man waving his arms, standing in stark contrast against the darkened skies. "Welcome," David E. said boisterously as he held his front door open. I was in a place almost impossible to find, with a white man I did not know who must have been close to 6'4", and I was about to go into his house for some hands-on healing. Buck me and my grand ideas. I cursed myself as I stepped through the doorway. "Please don't make me regret this. Please don't make me regret this," I chanted in my head. "I'm going to pour some water, yeah? Just sit on the couch and I'll take you into the room and we will begin," he said. In my memory, he says this in a South African accent. Maybe because I like that accent, but I know he does not sound like that. My memory wills him to sound South African. But David E. was born in Israel and speaks Hebrew as well as Spanish and English. I don't remember the peaks and dips of his accent, just that his voice was deep and big, like there was a canyon in his throat that amplified his words. I nodded at his instruction and walked towards the couch. I'm fucking crazy, I thought. David E. handed me the water and motioned for me to follow him down a hallway and into a small room with off-white walls, dim lighting, a massage table in the center, and 2 chairs up against another wall. The room seemed to be in the middle of the surprisingly large house. I made a quick mental map to the nearest exit. The work that we do here is very loud, and this room is good for it because it doesn't carry sound, he said, as he sat down in one of the chairs and pointed toward the other one. He sounded like a madman, because only madmen would comment on the soundproofing of a room. I swore to Creator, God, my higher power right then and there that if the energy session included unwelcome ass tickling, I would figure out how to murder David E. and I'd catch a Guatemalan prison sentence. "So you messaged me and wanted a session, yeah?" he said. "I'm leaving on a trip tomorrow and was not going to be working today, but it sounded important. And so what we are going to do here is I'm going to ask you some questions. We figure out what you need to work on before we start." I nodded. "Are you okay right now? Don't let me scare you. I'm loud and big, and I know that's different for most people and it can take people back, but trust me, I'm here as a helper. Feel free to tell me to shut up if I'm talking too much," he laughed. When he asked if I was okay, I became aware of my body language. My shoulders were pulled forward and inwards, and my spine was hunched over. I was making my physical body smaller around this big and bold man. I tried to relax into my seat and take up more space. He asked me routine questions about current stressors, life changes, specifics of what I would like to work on, and some queries about my mental health history. What we are going to do requires both of us to work. I'm not here with a magic pill. You will have to concentrate as well. I'm gonna leave the room, and when I do, you can get undressed. Just leave your underwear on and get under the blankets with your face down in the headrest. If you don't feel comfortable with that, then you can leave your shirt on. I won't pull the sheet past your hips, and I can work on your legs through the sheet, but the pants and the sheet are a bit much. If you want to leave your shirt, just don't keep a bra on because it's harder to work around, okay? I was dizzied with the idea of getting next to naked. I still hadn't fully arrived in my body. I was scared of the giant man. I could feel the memory of previous trauma taking over. My throat constricted. My heart rate began to elevate and my hands became clammy. It has taken years to learn how to separate my trauma responses from actual threat responses, and I still struggled to distinguish between the two. While I sat across from him, I could sense that everything would be okay, but my body told me another story. My body screamed danger. I took another deep breath and tried to unhunch my shoulders, but I could not arrive. I want to keep my shirt on, I answered him. "Helen," he said, a little gentler, staring at me. I looked at him. He extended his hands, palms upward towards the ceiling, and motioned for me to take them. I placed my hands in his. "Helen, keep asking if you're all right, and you keep saying yes. I know you aren't. I can tell that this is hard for you. I want you to look at me. I am only here as a helper in your journey. I only want to lead you to whatever healing work you came here for, and I will hold that space for you with the greatest love and care. I will not harm you, Helen. I am not here to hurt you, he said as we held hands, our knees touching and eyes locked. Before I had time to register an emotion, a sob lurched from my throat. Tears streamed down my cheeks while the giant Israeli man held my hands. After a few solid sobs, I sat back in my chair, my shoulders pulled up and back. He passed me a Kleenex box and left me to get settled to start the session. I lay on the table face down with my underwear on, shirt on, bra off, and waited for his return. I noticed he positioned a bucket on the floor directly under my face. David E. walked back into the room, and I asked, "What's this bucket for?" "A lot of people end up crying or spitting up stuff throughout this. It's there to catch anything you want to let out," he replied. "Oh, I didn't know it was supposed to be that kind of session." I stared into the presumptuous empty bucket like I would the eyes of a formidable enemy. I wasn't going to be blowing snot bubbles and dripping salty tears. I had a date with Carlos, the chef, after. "Okay, Helen, so how this works is I'm going to push on different parts of your body, like this," he said, pressing a finger or two on my mid-back. "And I'm gonna need you to breathe in deep and focus on breathing into the spot I'm pressing on. Try it real quick." I took a deep breath in, trying to direct the pull of air to the spot of flesh and muscle he pressed into. There you go. You can breathe in through your mouth or nose, but I want you to exhale through your mouth. This right here, Helen, this will be the work. He pushed harder into the now tender inch of skin on my back. And when you breathe into that spot, I want you to imagine a sound coming back with all the breath. Our bodies store sound and emotions, and we often don't give voice to it. Here is the opportunity for you to let your body talk. Some people growl, they howl, they scream, they cry. Some sounds people make I can't even describe. Whatever lives there, you let it out. And if I push too hard, you tell me and I'll stop, okay? "Okay," I answered. He released the pressure and gave my back a light, enthusiastic tap with his hand as if to say, "Let's get this howling, snot-bubbling party started." And he placed both hands on my shoulders and let his fingertips scan to see where he would begin. He picked a space between the nape of my neck and my shoulder and pushed in firmly. "Breathe," he directed me. I breathed into the spot. I had no idea what it meant to locate sound and release it, but I didn't want to disappoint David E. by letting my breath come back silent, so I settled for an exhale and a low-toned to accompany it. We repeated this with different parts of my body. All the while, I felt like I was crazy, trying to imagine sounds coming from square inches of flesh. I wasn't overly loud. I was conscious of my tone level, and I was polite about it. I wouldn't get whatever it was I was supposed to get out of this session, but I was trapped on his table now. I had to think up new sounds to come out of my mouth so it appeared like I was doing what I was supposed to do. A low, raspy rumble, a breathy growl, a light, high-pitched, ah. I felt like I was giving a moderately convincing performance, but David E. was having none of it. He pushed into a space below my right shoulder blade that was already tight and tender. I let out my light, high-pitched, ah. He pushed harder, and it hurt more. I let out the same sound, but louder. He pushed harder, and the pain intensified. I employed the childhood reasoning I had when I would get spankings with the pancake flipper. If you yell louder, it's over faster. So I let out my loudest scream yet, hoping it would stop the madman from pushing to my aching muscle so he would move on to the next area. The scream did not divert David E.'s energy, and he pushed even harder, making the pain unbearable. "Stop it, motherfucker, that hurts," I screamed out from his two-finger death press. "There you are," David E. yelled back at me like a proud daddy. "This is your body, Helen. If you are hurting, you tell me to stop. you yell, you scream, be here, take up space. He gave my back another excited tap with his hand, a little harder this time, and I interpreted this tap as, giddy the fuck up and let's get to work.
Giddy the fuck up. I like that. Thank you for that, Helen. Now we're going to have a conversation about the book, about all of what we just heard and more. And in order to do that, I'd like to introduce you to our host and moderator for the evening, Jónína Kirton. Jónína Kirton is an Icelandic and Red River Métis poet and was born in Portage la Prairie, Manitoba, Treaty 1, the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis. She graduated from Simon Fraser University Writer's Studio in 2007. She released her first book, Page as Bone, Ink as Blood, in 2015, and was 61 when she received the 2016 Vancouver Mayor's Arts Award for an emerging artist in the literary arts category. Her second collection of poetry, An Honest Woman, was a finalist for the 2018 Dorothy Livesay Poetry Prize. Her third book, Standing in a River of Time, released in 2022, merges poetry and lyric memoir to take us on a journey exposing the intergenerational effects of colonization on her Métis family. Join me in welcoming Helen back to the stage, and also
anyway, we need to know, how did the date go with Carlos?
By the end of the session, like my eyelashes, which were glue-ons, were like hanging off. So I did have to go back and like fix my face. And we met down in Antigua. It was at a fountain. It was like a magical moment where he turned and it was like, hi, it's me from across the fountain. And it was a story, but that was that.
Well, maybe that'll be in the next book. Maybe that'll be in the next book. Got to save some material.
Yes.
Wow. So, hello everyone, and thank you. And thank you for that beautiful, beautiful reading. I've been living with this book for several days now, and to hear you read it added a whole other layer. Especially the David E. part. My goodness, when I was reading the book, I was so nervous. You really made us, tortured us with this. Is he going to be okay? Are you going to be okay? And then it turned out to be okay, but for the eyelashes. So thank you for leaving your northern bubble for us. We're very blessed to have you here. And thank you for Massy and Patricia. Thank you for having us. And I want to say thank you for writing this book. Like, reading it, I felt understood in a way that I didn't even know that I needed. I didn't know that I needed that. There's a fluidity in this book, and the book where it says it's a journey through pain on the way to becoming. I'll take these off. So reading it, I kind of felt like I was sitting with you at the kitchen table, or I was going for a walk with you, and that you were just sharing your story with me. And as we moved through the stories, I was having a conversation with you. So I've had a really nice chat with you about the ways in which our stories intersect and are similar, and the ways in which they're very, very, very different. But something about the way what you wrote, I felt seen as a woman, as an Indigenous woman. There's just something about it, the reverence that you have for the women in your life. It's not something I'm accustomed to in my own family. That's not at all the way it was. In the book, men are kind of the backdrop, which is interesting because in most stories that we see, like movies and stories, men are the center of the universe. And nothing wrong with them, I love them, but it was really nice to read something that had women at the center. And you said at one point in here, I know what it means to be seen. I know what it means to be seen when you can no longer see yourself. Speaking of one of your mother and your aunties, grandmothers, people who could see you. So since writing this book and releasing the book, I've been wondering, do you see this journey through the pain and on the way to becoming any differently now? Has that changed for you? And were there any surprises as you wrote the book? Did it reveal something to you that you had not thought of before?
I feel like you get a little bit like wiser with your prayers. Like I remember early on being like, I'm gonna pray for strength, and then someone's like, if you pray for that, you'll get like hard times that will like cultivate that strength, right? So now when I pray or I call things to me, I try to do it with like, oh, but I want to learn this in a gentle way, please. Like I feel like I've done my hard time. But definitely, I was talking with these two right here about that earlier in terms of like loss, and there was like, when you lose so much, and sometimes it's not even just individuals, like that could be relationships, that could be moving from a different place, losing a job or whatever that looks like, and you come to the space of being completely stripped down, and you hit that like surrender moment of like, okay, like I don't know what's gonna happen from here. There's also a magic there where you can, I find that, and grieving the loss of my mom and my grandma got me to that space where I'm like, I can really become anything I want because I am a complete blank canvas. Like I'm not attached to the idea of myself anymore because I'm so humbled by life. And I feel like it's given me that knowledge, and sometimes I might be a little bit resistant still, being like, but no. But I feel like that's a part of becoming, right? And like really learning not to polarize emotions of like good or bad. I'm like, this is just human experience, and we're here to like face the whole gamut of it and to be able to move through it in the best way that we can, which is sometimes messy, right? We're very human, and sometimes not so full of grace, but yeah, there's that space to become, and I think it's taught me that. And then the other part was just about anything surprising. Yeah, there was stuff that was supposed to be in this book that's not in there. And there was like a point where I was like, wow, I have these ideas of what needs to be in there that are tied to what's expected of me from people in my own family, from community, and this is stuff that I made up in my head, right? So I was like, that they expect of me. And then I had to have this like humbling conversation with my editor of being like, I have to give myself permission to write what I need to write and let it be what it needs to be, versus, you know, the expectations that I think are there. And so allowing myself that piece was like a big growth piece for me too, like in general. Yeah.
Thank you. I have to read from my paper because I cannot remember everything I had hoped to say. When you're up there, you mentioned something about, I'm going to reframe that. And I was wondering about word choice, and I know we talked about this a little bit on Zoom, but I couldn't help but notice that your word choices were, it was always something more, even if it was something difficult, it was gentle. There was, and that's something that's a theme throughout the whole book. So is reframing things something that you think about a lot in your life? Because when we have difficult stories to tell, there's more than one way to tell them. Mm-hmm. And you also mentioned not wanting to tell the whole story about your mother's, it was her body and her sovereignty. So those choices, like what we leave in and what we don't, what we put there and what we don't put there, and how we reframe things so that it's something that someone can read and not cause them harm. Mm-hmm. I think about that a lot when I'm writing. Do you as well?
Yeah, I went to school for social work, so I was like, I feel like the helper in me is like, how can we do this in a gentle way? What does that look like? But also I think, you know, in terms of reframing, that's something that we engage in throughout our lives. And in there I talk about the spiral for a chapter, and every time like you come to a story that you experienced, or someone might say like trauma or anything, and it comes back up again, like it's just a new vantage point, so you can engage with it from a different space. And I feel like that allows me to reframe my own story every time something revisits, and I'm like, okay, I can see this differently, I can tweak how I engage with this, and how I see it. And then I think for reframing, I don't know, when we asked this over Zoom, like she was like, did you think about this word choice and that word choice? I was like, no, I didn't. Like, I didn't know that. But one of the things that I did think about was just like reclaim versus remembering. And for me, that's like, those memories are inherently there, or that knowledge, that traditional knowledge is inherently there. And this life where we're living under these colonial systems in a space that is like rapid change, is like the forgetting. And so we're just kind of sweeping things away, and it's there. And I remember this one woman, she's Kelsey Kalana, who is an amazing writer herself. She posted once about her son, and she said, you know, she was talking with him, and she was like, well, what if we didn't know our language? Like, what if that? And he's like, we would just dream it back. And I was like, that's beautiful, you know, to know and to trust that. So.
Oh my goodness. Dreams. That was on the next page. Oh my goodness. There's so many things I want. There's so many beautiful lines. I had to part the waters of religion to see what lay on the river bottom. When I read that, I thought, wow, that was a beautiful, beautiful line, and that the world demands quantifiable evidence. I find that hilarious, personally. I think they're really missing out. There's so much that can come to us, right, and through us. And so I've heard people say that we need to develop like a two-eyed way of seeing. And you say that you have lived at the intersection of the old ways and colonization, and that you crafted a voice that would be listened to. I really was struck by that you crafted a voice that would be listened to. How did you even know that you needed to craft a voice that would be listened to? That would be something that, until I was a writer, and I came to writing very late in life, 50 when I started writing, that struck me as something really beautiful. So you knew that you needed to craft a voice that would be listened to. How did you know that, and how has that been? Because your writing's beautiful.
Yeah, so I feel like that understanding of crafting a voice that would be listened to had nothing to do with like writing in a literary sense. That was more through advocacy work. And so when I was working around issues regarding violence against Indigenous women and violence against Indigenous lands. And I remember when we were doing the Rocky Mountain Ford Camp, and I talked about it in there where I was asking for, or during interviews, I kept mentioning that connection, and it was never making it into the newspaper. I think I did like 4 of them, and it didn't show up, and I was so frustrated. And I was like, this is a real connection because we've been experiencing it. We know what that looks like. We know what that feels like. And I remember talking with this one reporter, and he finally included it. And I was like, okay. And I learned in those spaces through like trial by fire in regards to like media and platforms, was like, if you need to get a point across, like you have to have a voice that will be listened to, and being able to pull in different things. And so even from then, noticing the gap, it was like, okay, well, what do I do now in order to highlight that connection? And so then I like wrote 2 academic articles, and we did a documentary with CBC, and I was like, how can I fill this gap then? So then I could be like, actually, look, like there is some research. And I think over the last few years, there's been some amazing research that has come out in that space as well, to kind of, I guess, like, acknowledge, what am I trying to say? See, I lose words too. Like, I'm very human. Yeah, and I think in that way, I had to learn how to craft a voice. And then when I get to write, I think that's just like me being vulnerable and me being able to show up as myself, as someone who like fell in love with words at a early age. So
You talked about going to the library.
yeah.
Oh, God. That made me think of Richard Wagamese, because that's something that he talked about a lot, was the libraries, how we need them, and how it changed his life, and he became a writer as well. Sadly, he's not with us anymore. So I love that you grew up knowing the legitimacy of dreams. I mean, so many lines, I read them and I was almost going to stand up in my living room and yell, yes! Nobody was there to witness that, but I really felt like I was feeling validated. You talked about the space of knowing and dreaming is where Mama still walks with me. I just loved when I read that line. And reading your book, I ended up having a dream. And so I don't dream very often. I'm not a dreamer. I tend to get messages other ways, but my mother came to me, and my mother's passed as well from cancer 35 years ago. And she came to me in this dream, and I was really feeling that when I'm around people who are more open to such things, I do find that it shifts for me. Do you find that as well? If you're around people who are closed, do you find that some of that stuff is shut off from yourself?
I think more so like when you sit with someone who walks in the world in a certain type of way, like it just reminds you to remain like grounded and rooted and to be in the world that way as well. So I feel like there's people that I interact with or that I journey with or journey in life with that are that reminder for me of like, oh yeah, you're a spiritual being, like slow down, bucko. You know, why don't you pray a little or go down to the water? And we need people that are reminders in that sense. And I'm really grateful for like even, so my cousin who is a professor at UBC, she's like, you're so embarrassing. She's down there. I'm gonna point you out too. This is like I feel like Richard Knott, like my dad right now. But we had this lovely conversation today just about dreams and about intuition and signs and like creepy Airbnb places that may be haunted or not. But that's also that reminder for me to like, oh yeah, you know, that's what that can look like. Or what was your experience with this? What does that look like? And I think when we do that, we're all just kind of like nudging each other, being like, okay, like pay attention.
Yeah. Remember, right?
Mm-hmm.
Remember that we have this, remember that we have access to these things. My mother was my first country. Mothers, bodies, land, women, bodies, land was a theme throughout. And I was just really struck by that. Women are the holders of place memory. So you talked quite a bit about where you're from and how that land has been a part of your life and part of your family's life forever. For some of us, we haven't had that type of experience. I mean, I've lived everywhere in Canada, not everywhere, but you know, Labrador all the way over to here, various places. I do feel that each of those places has a little home inside of me, and when I think of those lands, I can feel them. And I went to Iceland recently, and I've never been there, but my grandmother is from there. I was amazed when I touched that land. So when you leave your land and you come home, how does that feel for you? Like coming home?
Yeah, so it depends on how long I'm away for, but if I'm like traveling and if I've been away for a long time, you can feel like that tension release in your body of being like, oh, this is home. Like my body knows when it hits a certain part of north and like it just shifts and I'm like, oh, that feels really good. Like I know I'm in a space where the land also knows my name. Like we're in relationship, but also, you know, I think of what that looks like when we live in different spaces and, you know, have that practice of also introducing myself to like ancestors and spaces when I'm visiting other lands as well, knowing that they're there. And I lived for some time in Knopf and Syilx territory, and I lived in Merritt and then in West Kelowna. And I remember I was going back home And I made the decision after they did the approval for Site C. I think it was like winter time, maybe 2014-15. And I was like, hey, I'm gonna go home. And I was waiting for my contract to end, and I was going back from Kamloops to Kelowna, and you go through Merritt, and there's that dip, and I was like, I don't know if I'm ready to go home. At that time, I was only like 2.5, 3 years sober, and I was like, this is really scary to go back and be like in all of the dynamics. I don't know what that looks like, and I was praying and talking out loud, like, am I ready? Am I gonna be okay? Like, I'm terrified. And it was almost if like I could feel the ancestors in that territory of being like, we've looked after you, you're gonna be okay, you can go home. And I was like, okay, like I can trust that, and being really, really grateful for being watched over while in a different space. And then I had this like little giggle when I was like writing this, because I was like, I wonder if like my like child or my grandchild goes there, if they'll know them, and being like, oh, you're Helen's, like we knew you at some point, because I think about that, right? Because land holds memory, and like, yeah. So I'm like, I don't know. I guess maybe my grandchild will tell me, like, I went there and I felt this, and I'm like, this is why you felt that. But
Yes. Oh my goodness. That makes me think of one thing you said. You talked about by matching people to place. I love this so much. I am trying to understand how they have come to know the world. And I think often myself about how the land informs our practices. So they are not necessarily transferable I'm from Manitoba. What we did there doesn't feel quite right here. I can remember being in Banff and finding that I couldn't play the music I normally play. The land didn't like it. I had to switch up what I was playing. Yeah, so, and you can feel that on people too, you can feel it. And so much throughout the book, of course. So women were the keepers of the burdens. That was really, you had many women to do that. In my family, it was just my mother and myself, and she left me quite early. And so once she was gone, it was just me. You talk about I was a child growing into a space held by strong women. I was so struck by that, I can't imagine what that would be like, and I think that's something that colonization has robbed us of, that we don't have those, for some of us, we don't have those strong women. Patriarchy was pretty strong in my family. And you say this, I love this, our women will not be removed from where they belong, from where we belong. Our women will throw down when it comes to love. Our women will have hard conversations. Our women will protect other women. And that, again, I was really struck by that. Yeah, there's so many places to go with that. So when you were growing up, you felt protected by the women around you? Or was that something that you later came to feel?
that's probably something that came in different ways when I was a child, but there was also things that they weren't able to protect me from, like life happens, right? And I think when I was a youth, it was like, why don't you just let me live my life? Like that kind of vibe.
Yeah.
But then coming full circle and then being able to rest in that, because my mom, like, she was fierce, and my dad would just kind of like sit back. Like I remember one time they had to go pick up my cousin out of town because this person, it was scary. Like this person wasn't letting her go. Finally, she convinced them to like meet them on this like road out in the boonies, and when that vehicle pulled up, like my mom got out and she went up to this vehicle and like reamed out these guys for making it difficult for them to like let go of my cousin, which was really scary. And my mom was up there like yelling and screaming and like ready to fight. And my dad just sat in the truck. I was like, you just sat in the truck and let her go ape. He's like, I was watching. I had a club. Like, it's like, don't worry. But it was my mom who was that like front line, like would throw down for you and ensure that you were taken care of. And even my my auntie. So I recently, and that's why this was postponed, because I recently lost my eldest auntie on my mom's side. Not my great aunt, but my Auntie Diane. My Auntie Diane was very much like take no bullshit kind of woman. And when I would sit in meetings as like a grown woman, I would be like, hey, what would my Auntie Diane do? Like, what would she do? And it was like, she would say something. And I'm like, I have to say something. And so learning to craft my voice and speak in spaces, even just through memory of like how they were in the world. And I'm really grateful that I had so many role models in that sense.
Thank you. June and Daryl. I love what you wrote here. A man is flesh, fingernail, bone, dreams, and maybe some grit if he's lucky. But sometimes a man is a door that a woman can walk through to enter a world she cannot access on her own. When I read that, I thought so much of my growing up years of being trained to be marriageable material. That was the main focus of my upbringing, was that I should become marriageable. But I also thought about my mom and dad, because my father is Métis and my mother was white. And in this, you talk about that door that is opened for you when you have a partner that is white. For my father, it was my mother. And in one way, that was a double-edged sword, because he also felt less than around her in some ways, and I'm not sure how well her family accepted him. You talk about the expectation of white propriety and other things like crying after a few cases of beer. So I was just thinking so much about my own family as I was reading these things, and thinking how the only time I saw my dad cry was when he was having some drinks. And he would talk about being a Korean War vet. And it was very sad. And you talk about men a little in the book, and the one thing that struck me so much was when you said, I'm a little girl in a bathtub. This line, I'm a little girl in a bathtub, I am safe, I am loved. That you had the experience of that is just so lovely, and that you share that with us is beautiful. And then there's also the hard things, and you just gesture towards them, the other difficult things. And you say to continue to hate is to continue to assimilate. So the book is largely about the women in your life, but there's also talk of the men. When did you come to this understanding or need, or knowing that to hate is to assimilate?
Sightsee. Sightsee comes up through this, because it was like, it was such a divisive, and can still sometimes be a divisive topic back home. And I was working as a social worker, so I was doing wellness work and advocacy for Indigenous families. And for me, I was like, that stuff is still very important. Like, I won't let anything that has to do with Sightsee and the work that I'm doing there stop me from being in relation in a good way and working with individuals to like find better pathways or healthier pathways or clear some trauma or whatever that looks like. And so for me, I was like, if I buy into that, then that's creating division amongst our people, and that interrupts a healing process or a way to be in relationship together. And I remember when I had went to Guatemala and met with Indigenous communities impacted by mining, they talked about that, where there was like families that were split up, like father turned against son because of these activities, and depending of who was working for who or what that looked like. And in our family home, because I come from men that, you know, work in hard labor jobs, that we just essentially had a rule of like no talking energy projects at the table. Like, that was just it. My mom was like, yeah, and once we go to a picket line, you guys aren't allowed to cross it. And that's what she would say. But it was just like, in this household, like, we're here because we love each other. And we're not gonna allow the politics of like outside of division. And then you think about that, like when projects come into spaces or things that are divisive in that way, it's usually like, okay, it's either this or starve, or this, or you don't have a lot of other options either. There's a lot I can say on that point. Anyways, yeah, so I ramble.
So do I. Well, I've got so many things that I wrote down about your book. Oh my goodness. And so you're a mother, and I'm a mother as well. And I found, I was a single mother for 14 years, and you said that you knew not to choose a partner from that broken space. And that's why I was a single mother. I wanted a child, but I knew I couldn't pick the right kind of guy. So I just went for the child. But when I was thinking about that, I was thinking about the difficulties of raising children for all of us, whether we're here, whether we're up in your community, the need to protect our children, while we've got all sorts of things going on, right? And I was thought about something that I read all the time to myself to remind myself, and it was by someone called Araya Mountain Dreamer. And she says, I want to know if you can get up after the night of grief and despair, weary and bruised to the bone, and do what needs to be done to feed the children. So in your home, it sounds as if there's probably more hands than just yourself in your community to raise your son. Has that been true for you, or was it you that had to get up after those hard days? Because it must have been difficult when you lost your mother and other family members that were so dear to you. Did you find it hard to get up and take care of your son? I know that's deeply personal, but I know that's very personal. But as a mother, that was my first thought.
I had to learn to just like be at peace with my capacity, because there was a point, I don't know if it was after my mom passing, where I was like, my son didn't make it to school on time every day. I had a hard time getting out of bed. Yeah. And I was like, thank goodness you're in grade 9 and they can't fail you right now. But having to give myself that compassion of like, this is really, really hard. I don't know how to function as I did. And so now when things are going on, so for example, when my auntie passed recently, I just had this conversation with him of like, look, mom's gonna, we're gonna do easy made meals for this next bit. This is what this is gonna look like. I might be a little bit disconnected, but I'm just processing. In 2 or 3 weeks, I'll land back down and we'll kind of get into more of a routine space. So he knows, because he'd be like, why aren't you spending time with me? And I was like, I need to be babied, Matthias. I'm like, me. But being able to talk with him, because we've been through that. And so having those conversations of what that looks like and what healing looks like, and even talking about in our family, what projections might look like, and trying to build a language for them that I didn't have when I was growing up, and a lot of us aren't born with, in terms of a language of healing and understanding how people go about that, and explaining it to them when they're young. And I think what a brilliant head start some of these kids get to be raised in spaces where they're able to talk about it. Of course, my son's a teenager, and he's like, okay, mom, our language of healing.
And I'm sorry if that was an unfair question. I just had to ask it, because I know that it's something that I think about myself as a mother. My mother was a collapsing mother, they call it. Clarissa Pinkola Estes talks about it in Women Who Run with the Wolves, and I did not want to be that. Although I was teetering many times on the edge of being the collapsing mother. There was one more thing that I was going to say, and then we should let people ask questions. I'm being selfish here. Maybe I'll let you ask a question, and then I'll go back to another one. Does anyone have a question? Comment?
I'll start. So first of all, I love your mother and your grandma. They are so relatable as just amazing matriarchs, and I feel like I know them and I can see them in you. So thank you for sharing them with us. And I love the imagery with the land too. Yeah. I'm going to segue a bit based on what you were talking about women Indigenous women and violence towards Indigenous women in the land, and stuff you've talked about with all these resource-based projects. And I'm curious to know, because obviously as an advocate, how do you advocate for women when it is so divisive, like families, people being fed? How do you communicate that to people in your Indigenous community about the violence towards women that comes when we support these projects?
I think people in the community know that because they've lived it. So they've experienced that, and especially because like oil and gas in the region, like there was like this boom, right? And all of a sudden there was all of these men coming from outside, and so a lot of our people have already lived that, and they know that and understand it. And I think about not even just like the women, but the men that work in these spaces and the amount of racism that they face. Like it's a lot. I feel sad for my brothers a lot of the times with the stories that they tell in terms of what they endure and what they just bite down, and you go to work, you get things done. And I don't know, I feel like that's still like parts of that question are still things that we're learning how to answer and what that looks like. And I find when I just said that part about language too, is like, how do you talk about things that people don't talk about yet, right? In families, not just like on the bigger sphere, but in families and in communities, and changing and shifting dynamics that have been existing for some time, because that in itself takes a lot of work. And I'm just thinking of a note that you had sent before. Watch you be like, that was my question next. But you had said something about like, if we don't learn to uphold our women, how will we ever have right relationships with the land?
Yes.
And there was a really interesting interview done with Harold. He wrote, I was like, you know. But he was talking about the history of alcohol in
Firewater.
Yes, Firewater.
Yeah.
So he was talking about the history of alcohol within a specific community, and he was like, back in the day when there was like hunters who would come around, sometimes they would bring like whiskey or something hard that we didn't have access to. And he's like, so when they came, they wanted a party, like they would invite Indigenous women to their parties. He's like, and then eventually, like when there were miners that were in that area too, there was day shift and night shift. So if the day shift was like going, the night shift was partying, and if the night shift was going, the day shift was partying. And he's like, and again, only our women were invited. And you can just like think of all of the violence that happened, but I was like, that's all resource-based too, like taking from the land in terms of like animals and whatever other resources, and then mining as well. And so that connection is deeply rooted. We just have been so accustomed to it for so long that it's harder for us or some people to actually see and understand that connection.
And you mentioned it's sometimes we don't know how to talk about these things within families, and especially with the men. So the women talk about it, but we don't necessarily talk about it to the men. In your book, you talk about your dad hearing a poetry reading of yours about a sexual assault. I think it was your dad, and he called you, and he was crying. And so but had your mother already known? Yeah, I thought so. So we'll tell our mom stuff that we might not tell our dad, and there's so many reasons for that. You talk about being closer to her than water when you're speaking of your grandmother. Yeah. And I thought that was just such a beautiful thing. So that river, the water, and you and her, that picture of the three of you together, and that she'll always be there with you in that water and with your water that's within you. It's beautiful. And you mentioned your family was so ill-equipped for grief, and that you did not want to beg or borrow things that were not yours. I yearn for things that belong to me. As one who wasn't raised with her culture, I can really relate to that for sure. So you cut your hair. We probably need to end soon, do we? How are we doing for time? So you would cut your hair. Can you talk a bit about that? Because look at your hair. I mean, I can't imagine it being cut. And I'd like to, I know you speak about it in the book, but can you share a little bit more about how it felt when you did that? What you did, the process, the ceremony?
I want to go back to water.
Okay.
So, my grandma said that you're closer to me than water, and I didn't realize until after that. So my nickname, or my childhood nickname, was Chewy. Like, not like Chewbacca, although my brothers would follow me around and make like the noise at me all of the time. But Chewy just because I chewed on things. And my grandma, when she would put me to sleep, she would scratch my back and she would just say, chew, 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 over and over again. And chew, actually, in Deniza, is the word for water. And so it was like all this time my grandma was chanting like water, water, and scratching my back and putting me to sleep. And I thought about that after, and I was like, man, like I really am closer to my grandma than water. Like that's inseparable. And so part of me like carries that around when I feel, you know, distance. And we keep like people close to us through small rituals, right? And so one of the things with my grandma is like I have one of her floor length nighties and I'll put that on, and my grandma put bear grease in her hair, and I feel like that's how my hair grew so fast too, is like when I was missing her, I'd put on her nightgown and put bear grease in my hair and like make an instant cup of coffee because that was her go-to, and really like try to like summon my inner Junie Bigfoot. And you know, so much of who we are can often be tied up into our hair. And I remember like in my early 20s, like not really having a grounded understanding, but it would be like life change, like breakup, haircut, like life change, breakup, haircut, until I had like really short hair. And I was like, hey, I gotta think of like new ways of how to do this in the world. And then I just let my hair grow for a really, really long time. And it was just like, became like a place of like power, but also like a point of pride because I come from like women who had like really big hair too. And in that process of like it being gone was just like, okay, like I really don't know who I am. And like feeling it and knowing the length was like, okay, you know, I'm on this journey. And it was a reminder, a constant reminder of just to be easy with myself and to go slow of like, yeah, this is a real thing. And then when it came to like where my hair finally grew up to the same length that it had been before, I didn't realize how much mourning there was in that too, because that also made me sad. And I was like, oh, okay, like this reminds me of like pre-loss, but I'm in such a different space now. And understanding that like hair can tell such a story. Like there's a specific white hair where I was like, this came on that day. But now I have like a handful, so I can't pinpoint all the stories anymore.
Interesting. I once heard that our hair holds a lot of energy in the past and all the things that have been going on around us. Oh,